what we should do. We must actually do something.
Deputy Speaker, I'm learning to love my place in the pecking order in this building. First of all, I get to hear splendid debates like the one we've had this evening in their entirety, and in particular the thoughtful and moving speech of my friend, the member for Derby North, but also because by my maths I've got an hour. So I hope you're sitting, oh dear, well maybe half an hour. I hope you're sitting comfortably. Anyway, Mr Deputy Speaker, 4 years as Deputy Mayor for Policing taught me everything I needed to know about the dreary cycle of despair which our criminal justice system had become. The endless merry-go-round of the same people going through the hands of the same organisations year in, year out turned me into a convicted penal reformer, and so I'm extremely pleased to welcome the bill today. My 4 years at City Hall left me broadly with two frustrations that I wanted to share with you this evening, because I think they have some bearing on the bill. The first is that while there are attempts, and have been attempts, at rehabilitation before in the criminal justice system, presumably, hopefully, not as ambitious as that of the Right Honourable Lady, too often the effort was spread and the money was spread far too thin. The jam in a finite world would be spent very thinly across the youth estate and the adult estate, to the extent that the marginal difference that funding or any programme might make was hardly noticeable. And when you look at the research into rehabilitation programmes tried in the criminal justice system over the last 30 years, not many of them have made a difference above 2 or 3%, and much of that has often been explained away by the characteristics of the people they've been dealing with. So while this bill is extremely welcome, I approve wholeheartedly of the bias towards rehabilitation in Part 1 of the bill, and while I know that much of the radicalism of the Lord Chancellor's programme is in the White Paper, I would urge her to think carefully about where she puts her resources. For my money, the earlier you spend it, the better. By spending money on offenders between 18 and 25, you're going to get much more bang for your buck than spending it on, sadly, on somebody over 25. The truth about crime is that generally people either grow out of it or they become habituated in it. And that's why the bulk of offenders tend to be under 25, and hence that's where we should be spending the money. If we had endless money, you'd obviously spread it, but we don't, and I would urge her to spend it below. So that was my first frustration. My second was the paltry sentences that were often handed out for very, very serious crimes. We would have individuals in London convicted of quite serious non-fatal stabbings who would be given 4 years, out after 24 months. It really is a disgrace, and certainly not a significant deterrent, as we learnt in London, to the commission of those kind of crimes. And the truth is that they were being given those sentences let out that early because of the pressure on the system, because of the numbers in the system. Again and again I would get the message back that the police and the CPS were nervous about putting cases in front of the courts because of the pressure upon prisons, and often that the youth estate was struggling to take the people they should be taking, particularly given that they often had to separate individuals because of gang affiliations. Now that means we need to clear out some space. In short, my view is we're locking up far too many of the wrong people, and we're not locking up the right people for long enough. There are lots and lots of clever, smart, technology-based disposal these days available for low-level offending, tagging and testing, which we should really be pushing hard and putting into effect in this country in a much more enthusiastic way, so that we can clear space in our prisons for longer sentences for those convicted, particularly of serious, violent crime. On the second part of the bill, the courts section, I welcome the reforms, and particularly the use of technology, because we know that there are two deterrents broadly to committing crime. The first is the probability of getting caught, and that's down to the skill of the police. The second is the certainty of sentencing and the swiftness of sentencing. Prisoners who are criminals who are caught and then put before the courts swiftly, with certainly the knowledge that they will be convicted and they know what their sentence is going to be, are much more likely to be deterred. And so anything that brings about swift and certain justice is to be welcome. So overall, I think the bill is heading in very much the right direction. There are, though, 3 areas that I'd like the Secretary of State to consider where I'd welcoming amendments from me. The first is about the probation service. I've long held the view that we will make very little progress on rehabilitation of offenders outside of prison until the police get involved. For my money, probation should be an arm of policing. Offender management taking place in the community should be done by the police. Not only would that be more effective, they have personnel 24 hours a day in those communities, able and already monitoring many of those offenders, but also it would yield enormous savings. At the moment, there are double estates, double chief executives, double HR departments, and all those people, probation officers and police officers, are more often than not sitting in the same meeting talking about the same individual. Giving the probation service to the police, letting them manage offenders in the way they're supposed to, would be a huge step forward. If you consider the health service, if we separated GPs into a different department from hospitals, everybody would think we were mad. And yet we put the police and the criminals who they're managing in the secure estate and when they come out of the secure estate in different departments. Bringing probation back, I think, would be an enormous improvement and signal a step change in offender management on the streets that would make a huge difference. It would also save money. The 2 other amendments, I guess, are of less significance, but might help the Lord Chancellor with her budget. The first is to do with coroners' courts. I don't know how she voted in the bill when we had it here, but I am a proponent of assisted dying. Supported it for a long time. I think it's the next great Liberal cause for this country. But there is a wrinkle in the law which causes unnecessary distress to those who travel overseas for the purposes of seeking assistance to take their own life. At the moment, if you return from Switzerland, having taken your family return from Switzerland with your ashes, with your remains, then there is no inquest and you can scatter the ashes and go about your business in privacy. If, however, you wish to repatriate the body of the deceased, at the moment, because the death is deemed to be uncertain, the coroner has an obligation to open an inquest. There may well then be an autopsy. A criminal investigation will follow, but a prosecution won't, because the CPS have already given guidance that they will not pursue prosecutions of people who've travelled overseas for the purposes of assisted suicide. An amendment to the bill that would allow coroners the same discretion they have in this country for those kind of deaths, where they're satisfied that that is the purpose, that the person travelled overseas, and allowing people to bring bodies back for burial in the UK would both save time and money for coroners' courts, because there are several hundred of these people now, and it would also avoid enormous distress for families who quite naturally want to fulfil the wishes of the deceased, but fear prosecution and fear the inquest, and so therefore undergo cremation overseas. It's a small adjustment to an inconsistency in the law between prosecution by the CPS and what coroners are obliged to do that would relieve a huge amount of distress. And then the third amendment that I hope the Lord Chancellor will consider is to do with charging for testing of alcohol and drugs. She may be aware that some years ago I, from outside this place, managed to get alcohol abstinence orders onto the statute book. It was a huge battle in this House and in the House of Lords, but in the end we beat the then Lord Chancellor, the member for Rushcliffe, who objected to offenders where alcohol had been part of their offence being compelled to be sober for 3 or 6 months. Anyway, we got this on the statute book, but one of the items that the government would not allow in the scheme is that offenders in a scheme that works overseas are charged for their testing. When they turn up to be tested, they pay, in the US it's $1 a test, £1 a test, and it changes the psychology of testing. It means that the offenders who are undergoing testing of their sweat, their urine, their breath, whatever it might be, take more responsibility for their own sobriety, more responsibility for their own testing. They are investing, if you like, in their own freedom, because this avoids a prison sentence. It means they maintain contact with their families, they keep their job, but they are sober for 3 or 6 months, and if they have to invest a small amount in it, it A, means psychologically they take responsibility, but B, it means that the scheme itself is self-funding. And therefore, police and crime commissioners, who I have to say have not taken up this disposal with alacrity across the country, despite fantastic results in Croydon where it was tried, will have just the business case to do it, because it will be a source of funding for them. Did the Honourable Lady want to say?
My honourable friend for giving way. Would he also agree with me that one of the things that contributes to the success of these schemes overseas is the immediacy of the consequences? So in other words, if they fail the test, then they are immediately taken back into custody.
She's absolutely right. I mean, we at City Hall, we found this disposal in South Dakota, where it had taken off like wildfire as a disposal. The judges loved it, enormously effective, recidivism rates incredibly low, compliance rates up in the high 90s of this, and it was all based on this notion that, A, yes, justice was swift and certain if they contravened the rules of the scheme, but also that offenders were taking responsibility for their own punishment, if you like. They felt invested in it. Every time they reached for a drink, they had to decide whether they wanted to stay out of prison or not. And as a result, it's been enormously successful there and is spreading across the whole of the United States as a disposal. We have the power here. It just needs this small adjustment of allowing the police or the courts, whoever, to charge offenders a nominal amount for their testing. That would, after all, be the money they're spending on booze or drugs if it's drug testing. Allow them to invest in their own rehabilitation and therefore make some progress. So I welcome this bill. It's a refreshing step in the right direction, as I say, of breaking this dreadful merry-go-round with which I lived for far too long.
Richard Arthurs. Thank you.